Hi, everybody. We are here today with Dr. Ben Vivian, who is an assistant professor at the Coventry University on topics on sustainability and environmental management. And he has kindly agreed to give us a short interview on ISO 1416, which is a new standard published this year on guidelines on the assurance of environmental reports. So thank you very much, Ben, for being here today with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm going to ask a few questions from you today. So the first of all is to ask you in a nutshell to give us an introduction of what the standard actually covers.
Okay, yeah. So ISO 14016 obviously is part of the environmental management suite of standards under 14000. And it covers all aspects of assurance of reports. So essentially it takes different perspectives and provides guidelines for each of the key stakeholders involved in reporting. So from the perspective of the assurer, the person or organisation who is going to do the assurance of the report, on the information in the report, the reporting producer, and the user of the reports as well. It's an important distinction that we made early on when we were creating the standard, was that you needed to consider both the producer of the report and the user of the report as two separate stakeholders, and their interest in the content and therefore the qualities of assurance that is provided are important. So essentially there are three parties: the assurer, the producer, and the user, and they're all dealt with right from the very beginning of the process of engaging an insurance organisation through to the production of a report that goes to the producer of the report and sometimes goes to the user as well. And so it covers that whole journey, the whole process of developing a level of trust in the audience, the readership of a report, in the content, the qualities of it. So that's essentially in a nutshell what it is. And certainly when I set out and I guess it's partly down to my background, when I set out in this, because it's guidelines and not a requirement standard, I wanted it to be, in a sense, a bit educational. Mm-hmm. Because in my experience, I've been doing reporting for, crikey, 20 odd years. I think I probably contributed to my first environmental report 20 odd years ago, was the sole author of my first report in 2003. I've assured reports as well. So I've been on all sides of the process of reporting throughout the last 20 odd years. And that what I found is that the assurance process is it's a bit of black magic. It's a bit of witchcraft. It's a really unknown area. And you see these statements in these reports assuring the reader that the information is correct, but it's never really quite clear as to what the assurance has been, what it's looked at, and what it's trying to prove, and what its restricted limitations are. It clearly is limited for space in the report. The reporting organisation is not going to put in the entire assurance report on top of all the information it's providing. So it has to be brief, but sometimes its clarity is poor, and it doesn't really reflect, I don't think, what the assurance has done. So there's that side of it. I wanted it to be quite educational, to get people to begin to have a much deeper understanding as to what assurance could provide and what the limitations were as well, because assurance isn't a guarantee, and this is always a thing that I think we have to be very clear about as standards writers in this field, and indeed as reporters in this field. It's not a guarantee that everything is correct. It's an assurance that the process has been checked and that it's been found to be, appropriate and detailed enough and all that sort of thing. But it isn't going to guarantee the reader that every single thing in that report is absolutely correct.
Thank you very much. And is that also the reason why you got involved, so to be an educator in the field of this topic?
Yeah, I guess so as well. And I mean, I've used standards for a long time. I mean, before that, I got really involved in reporting. I was an ISO 14001 lead assessor and working in a certification body. As you may have checked out from my LinkedIn profile, my career is extremely broad and varied. I'm not a career academic. I've come to academia quite late, and I wanted to see what the process of standards development was all about. So this is my first standard, and I've not sat on other committees and groups. So I'm very much a neophyte to this whole process and learning as well. And so the people I worked with, both from the UK side, people like Nigel Lee Hain and Leslie at BSI too, but also a chap called Dick Hortensius, who works for the Dutch standards body, who was our secretary for the group, and he was just fantastic. And he was really supportive and patient, and took his time to explain all the processes. And every time I sat in a meeting and I said, well, I don't know what the process to do this is, and he would say, well, okay, I know how to do this, and we'll do this way. So I wasn't a passenger, but what I think I brought to the process was somebody who was new and therefore relatively objective and relatively independent of the standards process, and hopefully, in a way, paralleling the nature of the standard itself, which is about assurance of reports. It's about an independent assessment process. I was there, and maybe a bit too arrogant to sort of say that I was sort of then poking the process a bit to check that it was actually going to work right. And certainly the feedback I got from the people who were on the group, who were very experienced and from all over the world, was that they actually really appreciated the style that I had as a convener, because I didn't have a fixed agenda. I wanted to make sure that everything was clear. That was basically my objective. I wanted to make sure that whatever we wrote was clear to the reader. And I think we've really achieved that. There are inevitably going to be some areas where some difficult choices had to be made, and I might come on to that when we talk about some of the other standards, because there are a lot of not competing standards, but complementary standards in this field. So it wasn't straightforward in terms of writing just exactly what we wanted to write, even though it's just guidelines, even though it's the first sort of standard of its type in this area. There were other standards we had to take account of in terms of the term definitions and some of the language we needed to use, so that we weren't going to confuse the user.
Absolutely. It's not an easy task to be a convener. So well done on that. And how did you find that experience? Because it can be difficult being the independent person trying to find a consensus between different worldviews and from people all over the world.
Yeah, and we did have some strong personalities. I'm not going to name any names, but it's inevitably going to be the case where you get people who are experts in their field and who are experienced and do have a perspective and maybe an agenda. I'm not sure that many people had a very sort of hard agenda. I think they had a number of agendas, but they perhaps were quite similar to me. It was quite a small group as well, so that was quite good. I think, certainly for my first experience, I think the most we ever had at a meeting was around about 15. And usually it was a hardcore of about 8 to 10 people, and it was a good group. And we seemed to get on quite well as a group. Whether that was anything to do with me, I have no idea. But it was quite a good group. There were some quite strong views expressed right throughout, actually, in terms of how the standard was being, how it would be used and so on. But I did find I really enjoyed it, actually, and certainly in light of what I'm now doing at university, where the group of students I have is, I think in the 3 years I've been there, we've had students from 18 or 19 different countries on the course that I direct. So having that international flavour is a really important part of what I do anyway, and I quite enjoy that. I enjoy the perspective, understanding the perspectives from different parts of the world. Because if you want to also get into the details of sort of environmental advocacy and environmental progress that we perhaps all want to see, certainly I want to see, and professionally I've been trying to do for the last 30 odd years, we need to take people along with us. And this, I think, has been a failing of the environmental community historically, is that it's very much been, we need to do this because this is the right thing to do. Well, it might be the right thing to do, but unless people are going to buy into that message, which they typically don't, the message won't get through. It'll be heard by those that already get it, and those that already understand it, but it won't be heard by those that don't. And it's those that don't that we need to start communicating with more effectively. So I think that seeing and hearing and listening and responding to perspectives we had people from Malaysia, didn't have that many from the Far East. We had couple of Americans, Canadian, they were quite consistent members of the group, a few Europeans, a Swiss, obviously the Dutch, the Italian, and so on. So it was quite, but again, you look at it and you go, well, and again, this is an interesting perspective from what I do now, is that, and I think this is a common problem within ISO, is that one of the continents that doesn't really engage as much as it should is Africa. Mm-hmm. And yet Africa has a huge range of issues that it's got to be better at coping with and better at managing and dealing. And I see that in my students. We regularly get students from Nigeria, got students at the moment from Nigeria, Cameroon and Kenya at the moment, mm-hmm. running on the MSc. So you get a really interesting perspective of what environmental sustainability is for people in Africa. And it's very different from what we see in Europe. Very, very different. You could argue that it's less well developed, but that's the life they have to live. That's the development that they have to go through. And so you end up with a very different perspective. So we might talk about life cycle analysis, and they're still worried about where the waste is going to go. Mm-hmm. And when you see the photographs of places like Nairobi and the amount of litter that's on strewn and uncontrolled landfilling that's going on in some parts of Africa, you can see why their concern is where it is, and it's not yet anywhere near life cycle assessment or reporting. So you can see why they don't engage, but it is an important area, I think, that ISO needs to look at in terms of engagement for these environmental standards, particularly, I think, because obviously it's a global issue that needs to be addressed. And if you've got a big chunk of the world not engaging, then we need to try harder as the ISO family to get them to engage.
Indeed, it's one of the 2030 strategic goals for them to get more countries involved, especially from the developing side of the world. So hopefully we'll see some changes in that area.
I think traditionally, and I went to one meeting in Halifax in Canada, and there were quite a lot of Africans there, actually. I don't wish to pick on the Africans particularly, because I think South America is also weaker in terms of its representation. It's not just about cost of getting to the meetings. It's not just, and particularly now when we've got the restrictions of travel that we're having to work with, and we're doing much of it in this format. Then cost of travel is not really in the equation anymore. It's about relevance, and it's about the context that people are, how they're living their lives in a particular part of the world, and how that is relevant to the standards that we want to create. Because if there's no relevance to the economic activity or to the level of development or to the ways of society, then the standard isn't going to make any difference. Absolutely.
You're already alluding to it. What do you think are going to be the effects of creating this as an international standard?
The effects of the standard, I think, will be initially I hope to educate to some extent, because as a guidance standard, it's obviously it isn't a requirement, and therefore there's no certification or indeed accreditation that runs alongside it. And one could argue that actually its scope is broader than just environmental information that it covers. Certainly from my perspective, when I joined the group, I was quite concerned that we were limiting ourselves to environmental only, and we needed to be broader in the sustainability field. But it still could apply quite well in that respect. So I think initially it's going to be to do with educational and getting the various parties involved, so the assurer and the reporter and the user, to start to have a similar type of understanding of what the process entails. One of the things that took quite a lot of conversation and debate, I suppose, around was only a few lines standard, which related to the assurer, the report and the reporter. And they're not convinced that the process of assurance that they have done themselves is adequate to deliver the output to the user community. And one of the things we argued long and hard about, well, actually not that long and hard, but we did argue about, was how much sort of teeth should we put into the standard to say to the assurer that you can actually walk away, and you're quite entitled to walk away from a job if the reporter isn't prepared to address the issues that you're stating are our problems. And that we need to stay away from this idea that just because you hire somebody to do an independent assessment, and just because you put a statement into the report saying that it's been checked, you're effectively then greenwashing the content of the information in there. And that needed to be avoided, because at the end of the day, this costs a lot of money. This process can be quite expensive. It has to add value and provide value to all the parties. And if it doesn't, then why do it? And why do it in a particular way? So that was that was quite a keen thing, I think, that we wanted to try and do, and certainly from my perspective.
Thank you for that explanation, Ben. And then I have one last question to ask. Is there any other standards you would recommend to use in conjunction with this one? Maybe there's also even other standards under development right now that will be useful in the future.
Yeah. Okay. I think the main comment I would have is that that there are quite a lot of standards, actually, and I don't want to list them all by number. I'll pick out a few. Some of the ISO 14060 series, 64, 65, to do with carbon, GHG information and reporting and that sort of thing. But there's also 17021, which relates to certification bodies, and those actual standards were quite key in the way we were writing the standard at the time, because both, or not both, because there are more than one in the 60s, in the 14060 group, but there was one standard, I think it was 65, one of the 65s in particular, I can't remember, it's a while ago since the conversations were around it, and 1721, which were being revised at the same time as ours was being created. And so we were working in a world which was constantly shifting, and definitions were being marginally changed, and occasionally those shifts and those changes changed the way we wanted to write the standard, or the way we needed to write the standard. And so we needed to be constantly monitoring what was going on in the other groups, and trying to get good relationships, which was not perfect, shall I say. I'm not going to name any names, but it wasn't perfect. I'm not sure why it wasn't perfect. We tried as hard as we could through a variety of routes to get some dialogue between the various groups. And it probably wasn't helped by the fact that we, at this stage, we were probably, I think it was going into a period when we were going to have a plenary, and then it was cancelled or postponed for some reason, and then obviously COVID came along. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't an opportunity to physically get together, which I think was a problem, because in the past, when we'd been in Halifax, for example, in, was it 2017, I think that was, 2017, 2018, anyway, 2017 or 2018, we'd had good opportunities to meet other groups and people, and have conversations amongst ourselves about what was going on. And I think that that dialogue or conversation, because it wasn't just a dialogue, it was multiple parties involved, was very useful. And when you work in a remote, digital, virtual situation, those conversations are very much harder to have. One could argue they're actually pretty much impossible to have, because the sort of informal conversations you have with people that you might have at a meeting like that, like a plenary meeting, they just don't come along. Mm-hmm. It's the same principle in workplaces. The water cooler the water cooler conversations and the kitchen conversations while you're making a cup of coffee don't happen anymore, and that's a real issue. So I think that sort of informal dialogue, while you had this big flux, changes to 17,021, changes to some of the 14,060 series, and our standard being created, 14,016 being produced at the same time, it did create a level of complexity and probably a marginally slight delay in the production of our standard, because we had to make some changes to some of the definitions to make sure that they were all aligned together. But I don't think it's going to be a massive issue in the end. But those I suppose are the key ones. But then the other side of it too is looking outside the ISO set of standards, is to make it, I think, quite a strong play at things like the CDP, carbon disclosure, and the GRI, which is the main sort of sustainability, the global reporting initiative, and their standards that are out there, which are not ISO standards, but they are very complementary. So you'd use 14,016 as an overarch, because GRI don't produce an equivalent of 14,016. They produce the standards of what goes into the report and how the report can be pulled together. So users and assurers and reporters, so the three groups that I've talked about in this sort of interview up to now, are all going to be users of the GRI, but there isn't something like that. There isn't an equivalent to 14,016. So I think that it sits as a nicely positioned in that respect, to sit across all of those different users.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben, for making some time. And who knows, we might have some follow-up questions coming to us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, hopefully we'll get some feedback. Because again, this is, and again, one of the things that might be worth asking in terms of feedback is, should this become a requirement standard? Because it is only guidelines at the moment, and it's not. There would be some work involved in changing it, but the skeleton is very strong. I think is the analogy I'd like to sort of give, is that the skeleton's there. Might need to change some of the musculature.
Yes, indeed. A good basis is there, but we can always improve in
Yeah.
future.
Yep.
Thank you very much.